The Sovereign Without a Country, Pirate First, Benjamin Franklin, and the Strange Political Problem of Existing Before Recognition. There is a category of political person the modern administrative state has difficulty imagining, not a citizen, not quite a refugee, not an immigrant, not a diplomat, not a corporate executive, not a tourist, and not necessarily a criminal, a political claimant. Without a recognized state behind him, this is the peculiar territory occupied by Pirate First, and it is precisely why something as mundane as publishing an Android application can suddenly become a geopolitical problem, because the question isn't really whether Pirate First can write software, he already can. The question is, who is permitted to stand between an unrecognized sovereign claimant and the institutions that demand a conventional legal identity. That question takes us unexpectedly back to Benjamin Franklin. The Franklin problem. The historical Franklin analogy is more precise than it first appears. In 1776, Franklin went to France on behalf of the newly declared American cause. He wasn't simply a wealthy American businessman relocating to Paris. He was part of a diplomatic project whose political legitimacy was being contested by the world's established power. France had not yet formally recognized American independence. That came in 1778, when France signed treaties recognizing the United States and entering into an alliance with it. Franklin subsequently presented his credentials as Minister Plenipotentiary, office of the historian +1. But something important happened before recognition. Franklin operated, he corresponded, he negotiated, he cultivated relationships, he represented a political project. He became a node through which an emerging political entity interacted with an established state. The United States did not first become powerful and then acquire Franklin. Franklin helped make the United States diplomatically real. That distinction matters. The conventional historical narrative often makes sovereignty look like a switch. Declaration, right pointing arrow; recognition, right pointing arrow; statehood, right pointing arrow; diplomacy. Reality is messier. Political entities frequently exist in the uncomfortable interval between assertion and recognition. Franklin inhabited that interval. Pirate First lives in the interval. Pirate First's claim is not, Mexico has recognized my sovereignty. It hasn't. Nor is the claim, I possess diplomatic immunity because I have declared myself sovereign. That would confuse assertion with recognition. The more interesting proposition is different. A person can maintain a political identity, body of work, institutional project and representational mission even when no state currently recognizes the political entity behind them. That is the condition we might call sovereignty without recognition, and it creates a peculiar institutional problem. The individual exists. The intellectual property exists. The publications exist. The software exists. The political record exists. The community may exist. The claims are documented. The mission exists, but the conventional administrative interfaces may not know what box to put any of it into, and bureaucracy becomes most revealing precisely when the box doesn't exist. The Google Play test. Consider the apparently ridiculous example that triggered this entire investigation. Pirate First wants to publish a free Android application. No subscription, no advertising, no attempt to extract money from users, just software. Yet Google requires developer identity verification. Google distinguishes between personal and organization accounts, and organization accounts require organizational documentation as well as identity documentation for the account owner or an authorized representative. Google Support +1. Suddenly the application has collided with a question that has nothing to do with programming. Who is the legal person standing at the keyboard? The programmer says, I am Pirate First. The platform says, we need legally verifiable identity. Pirate First responds, my political existence does not fit the identity architecture you are asking me to enter. The platform responds, then we cannot process the account. And there is the crack, not because Google is necessarily behaving improperly. Google has legitimate compliance obligations, but because commercial identity systems assume the world is already neatly divided into recognized persons, organizations and jurisdictions. Political history does not always cooperate. The false choice. The conventional response would be, become a normal Mexican resident, or return to Canada, or create a conventional company and put your personal identity behind it, or accept refugee status, or abandon the project. But those choices all smuggle in the same assumption. The individual must first become administratively legible before the project can become operational. Why? History offers another possibility. Build an intermediary. The trust as diplomatic technology. This is where the trust becomes fascinating. Not as a fraudulent disguise, not as a nominee arrangement designed to deceive KYC, not as a fake embassy, not as a mechanism for pretending that an unrecognized entity possesses privileges it has not been granted. Rather, a legitimate fiduciary institution can become the interface between the principal and the institutions of the recognized world, the difference between a mask and an interface. This distinction is essential. A fraudulent nominee structure says, pretend I don't exist. A legitimate fiduciary structure says, I exist and this is the lawful institution authorized to act on my behalf. Those are opposites. The first attempts to defeat KYC. The second satisfies KYC through a different legal architecture, assuming the relevant jurisdiction and institution recognize that structure. That distinction should be the foundation of Pirate First's institutional strategy, because the objective isn't to disappear, it is to become represented. The exile's paradox. There is another dimension to this story. Pirate First does not reject Canada as a civilization or deny the existence of Canadian law. Quite the opposite. His problem is precisely that the state exists, but returning to it is not necessarily a viable personal solution. An expired passport becomes more than an administrative inconvenience when the physical act of returning to the issuing state carries consequences the individual regards as existential. Meanwhile, Remaining outside that state creates another paradox. The person is physically somewhere. The state knows where he is. The person's public work continues. The person has a documented history, yet his institutional identity becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with the standard categories available to him. This is what makes the word exile more interesting than the word refugee in the political philosophical sense. Exile describes a relationship, refugee describes a legal status. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Recognition is not creation. This is perhaps the most important philosophical point. A government recognizing an entity does not magically create the entity's entire intellectual or political history. Recognition changes the entity's relationship with the recognizing state. It gives institutional consequences to something that may already have been claimed, organized and politically articulated. The American example demonstrates the sequencing problem. The Declaration of Independence came in 1776. French recognition and alliance came in 1778. The definitive British recognition came with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Office of the Historian. +1 between those dates existed a fascinating political creature, the United States. Before universal recognition, it had declarations, it had representatives, it had correspondence, it had military forces, it had commercial interests, it had diplomatic ambitions, it had supporters, it had enemies, and crucially, it had people acting on its behalf. Recognition followed political reality. It did not precede every manifestation of it. The modern problem, digital sovereignty now transposed the Franklin problem into 2026. Franklin needed printing, correspondence, diplomatic representation, financing, commercial agents, physical networks, trusted intermediaries, pirate first needs, software distribution, source repositories, publishing, infrastructure, payment infrastructure, intellectual property administration, cryptographic identity, institutional representation. The technologies have changed. The structural problem has not. The 18th century political entrepreneur encountered customs officials, royal courts, merchants and diplomats. The 21st century political entrepreneur encounters Google verification, payment processors, cloud platforms, social media moderation, corporate compliance departments, app stores, terms of service. The sovereign frontier has moved partly into software. The platform is the new port. A port once decided which ships could enter. Today, a platform decides which software can reach millions of devices. That doesn't make Google a government. It makes Google something arguably more interesting for this discussion, a private gatekeeper controlling a strategically important distribution infrastructure. Google can reasonably say, we have verification requirements. Pirate first can reasonably answer, then I need a lawful institutional representative capable of satisfying them without requiring me to reconstruct my entire existence according to the categories you happen to use. That is not necessarily an ideological confrontation. It is an institutional design problem. The trusted envoy, Franklin's greatest asset, was not merely his title. It was trust. He was trusted by the Continental Congress. He was trusted by French intellectual circles. He was trusted sufficiently by the French government to become an official diplomatic representative. Once relations developed, his network allowed the emerging American project to operate across a political boundary. The modern equivalent could be a trusted fiduciary. Someone, or an institution, with verifiable identity, fiduciary obligations, clearly documented authority, transparent beneficial relationships, lawful banking capacity, contractual capacity, authority to administer intellectual property, authority to represent the project to third parties. The point is not to hide Pirate First. The point is to give Pirate First an institutional hand capable of shaking hands with systems that cannot shake his directly. And that changes the political question. Instead of asking, is Pirate First sovereign, we can ask the much more interesting question, what can a political actor accomplish before recognition? That question has historical precedent. The answer is, quite a lot. Franklin negotiated before the United States possessed the mature diplomatic apparatus that later generations would take for granted. The American commissioners were already corresponding with France and seeking commercial and military assistance. Before the formal alliance of 1778, Office of the Historian +1 the political project had to operate before the diplomatic world had finished deciding what it was. That is the lesson. Pirate First does not need a passport to have a philosophy. A passport proves something important, but it does not prove authorship. It does not prove intellectual continuity. It does not prove political imagination. It does not prove that someone has spent years documenting an alternative institutional architecture. It does not prove that a body of work exists, and it certainly doesn't determine whether an idea deserves to be heard. The passport belongs to the state. The work belongs to its author. That distinction becomes particularly important when the author's relationship with the state becomes problematic. The MXTM archive is a political memory. Pirate First has done something that many political movements historically failed to do. He kept the archive, the articles, the arguments, the software, the experiments, the manifestos, the translations, the evolving theories, the failures, the reversals, the disputes, the attempts to build the public record. This matters because political legitimacy is partly a struggle over memory. Who remembers? Who documents? Who can demonstrate continuity? Who can show that yesterday's eccentric proposal became today's working prototype? Who can prove that the political identity existed before somebody else decided it was convenient to recognize it? In that sense, the archive becomes a kind of pre-diplomatic credential. Not legally equivalent to diplomatic credentials, but politically meaningful. The sovereign without a country. Perhaps that is the phrase. Not king without a kingdom. That metaphor is too easy. Not refugee without a passport. That reduces the political problem to migration. But sovereign without a country. A person whose sovereignty is presently an assertion rather than a recognized international fact. A person who therefore cannot demand the privileges of recognized statehood, but who can still build, write, publish, code, organize, correspond, create institutions, seek allies, create archives, develop fiduciary structures, and make the claim publicly enough that history can eventually judge it. That is the difference between recognition and existence. The great misunderstanding about sovereignty is often imagined as a flag. But before the flag comes an idea, before the embassy comes a representative, before the representative comes a correspondence network, before the treasury comes a trusted mechanism for moving resources, before the government comes administration, before the constitution comes political imagination, before recognition comes somebody saying, we exist. The danger, of course, is obvious. Anyone can say it, therefore the assertion alone proves nothing. Pirate First cannot manufacture international legal recognition by declaring it, nor can a trust manufacture diplomatic immunity, nor can an APK become sovereign because it has a Bitcoin address. These are hard boundaries, but acknowledging those boundaries does not require surrendering the political experiment. It simply makes the experiment more rigorous. The rule of the unrecognized. Here is the doctrine I would propose: never demand from an institution what it has no legal basis to grant. Instead, build the lawful institution through which the desired activity can legitimately occur. Want to publish? Build the publishing institution. Want to administer intellectual property? Build the fiduciary structure. Want to accept voluntary contributions? Build the lawful financial interface. Want to distribute software? Build the compliant distribution entity. Want diplomatic recognition? Build the political record, relationships and institutional credibility that might eventually make recognition conceivable. That is much more difficult than shouting sovereignty. It is also much more interesting. Franklin did not wait for history. Franklin didn't sit in Philadelphia waiting for Britain to concede the existence of America before beginning diplomacy. He went to France. He became the interface. He made the argument. He cultivated the network. He negotiated, and eventually France crossed the recognition threshold. Office of the Historian +1 Pirate First situation is obviously not legally equivalent to Franklin's. That distinction must remain explicit. Franklin represented a revolutionary polity that ultimately became an internationally recognized state. Pirate First presently represents a personal political project with no comparable state recognition. But the analogy survives at the level that matters. What does a political claimant do while recognition remains unresolved? He builds the passive protocol. And perhaps this is where MXTM's seemingly scattered obsessions finally converge. The newsletter, the software, the Nostr experiments, the sovereignty stack, the digital twin concepts, the NFP, the publishing archive, the open source applications, the idea of trusted hands, the insistence upon cryptographic continuity, the search for alternative distribution. These aren't necessarily separate projects. They can be understood as components of one experiment. How does an individual political actor build institutional continuity without first possessing a state? That is a serious question, and it doesn't require anyone to believe the sovereignty claim. Indeed, the experiment becomes stronger if skeptics are allowed to remain skeptical. Prove the architecture. Don't demand belief. Pirate First challenge. So here is the challenge Pirate First puts before the world. If a person possesses no recognized country of his own, but possesses authorship, a public archive, a political philosophy, software, intellectual property, a community, institutional ambitions, and the determination to construct lawful intermediaries, must every one of those things remain economically and technologically inaccessible until a state stamps the right rectangle onto a document. Or can the modern world develop new forms of representation between the individual and the state? That question belongs far beyond Pirate First. It belongs to dissidents, exiles, stateless people, digital creators, indigenous nations seeking renewed institutional expression, diasporas, unrecognized territories, political movements, whistleblowers, and perhaps eventually to millions of people whose economic existence becomes increasingly digital while their legal identities remain stubbornly territorial. The flag can come later. Perhaps the most radical thing Pirate First can do is refuse to pretend that recognition has already happened. No fake embassy, no counterfeit credentials, no invented immunity, no theatrical declarations demanding that Google rewrite its compliance manual. Instead, build the machinery, find legitimate fiduciaries, create accountable institutions, separate political assertion from legal fact, separate authorship from citizenship, separate distribution from ownership, separate recognition from existence, and document everything. Then let history decide what the thing was. That is how political experiments become historical objects. The sovereign without a country Pirate First may never become the founder of a recognized state. Perhaps the entire experiment will ultimately be remembered as an eccentric digital age thought experiment. Perhaps it will become something larger. Nobody knows, but that uncertainty is not a reason to stop documenting the experiment. It is the reason to document it more carefully, because every recognized political order was once unrecognized by somebody. America was not born internationally recognized. Franklin's diplomatic mission did not begin with an American embassy already waiting for him in Paris. The embassy came later, the recognition came later, the treaties came later. The country came into the international system through a process, and somewhere in that process stood an old man in a fur cap carrying an idea across an ocean. Today the ocean is digital. The port authorities are algorithms, the passports are databases, the embassies are sometimes organizations with websites and cryptographic keys, the printing presses are repositories, the pamphlets are applications, and the exile has a smartphone. Pirate First does not have a country to call his own, so he is attempting something more difficult than merely flying a flag. He is attempting to build The institutional machinery of a political identity before the world has decided what to call it. Maybe that is sovereignty, maybe it isn't, but history has a peculiar habit of becoming interested in people who keep building while everyone else is still arguing over whether they are allowed to exist. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter editorial note, the Google Play example is deliberately treated as an institutional case study, not proof of diplomatic status. Google's current rules expressly contemplate an organization account represented by an authorized individual, but that requires a genuine legal organization and genuine authority. It is not a mechanism for evading identity verification. Google support +1, and that distinction makes the political argument stronger, not weaker. Pirate First's project is not, how do I trick the system into recognizing me? It is, what legitimate institutional architecture can represent an unrecognized political principle to systems that require conventional legal counterparties. Substack note, sovereign without a country. What happens when a political identity exists before recognition? Pirate First isn't asking the world to pretend he has a state. He's building the machinery that lets an unrecognized sovereign operate anyway. Franklin understood the principle. The flag can come later. The work cannot wait. Hashtag Pirate First. Hashtag MXTM. Hashtag sovereignty. Hashtag political exile. Hashtag Benjamin Franklin. Hashtag diplomacy. Hashtag recognition. Hashtag statelessness. Hashtag diaspora. Hashtag digital sovereignty. Hashtag sovereign identity. Hashtag institutional design. Hashtag trust. Hashtag fiduciary. Hashtag open source. Hashtag digital freedom. Hashtag Android. Hashtag FOSS. Hashtag F-Droid. Hashtag Nostr. Hashtag Bitcoin. Hashtag decentralization. Hashtag political philosophy. Hashtag exile. Hashtag autonomy. Hashtag future of governance. Hashtag post-corporate. Hashtag sovereign stack. Hashtag MXTM vs. X sovereign without a country. Franklin operated before American recognition. Pirate First builds before recognition. The flag can come later. The work cannot wait. Hashtag Pirate First. Hashtag MXTM. Hashtag sovereignty. Hashtag exile. Hashtag diplomacy. Hashtag recognition. Hashtag digital sovereignty. Hashtag FOSS. Hashtag Nostr. Hashtag Bitcoin. Hashtag autonomy.